Good evening, Queensland. I love being back in Queensland. I've had so many happy memories. I was conceived in Queensland. Not that I remember that, but it was up in Townsville at the end of the war. My dad was a fighter pilot, my mother a WAF, and I was conceived on Magnetic Island. The only thing I've got in common with Julian Assange. And marriage, too. I met my wife over the road, Brisbane Town Hall. I was doing a hypothetical. I persuaded Joe Bajelke-Peterson to come on, and I wanted to sit him next to someone the complete opposite, someone young and beautiful and uncorrupt, and Kylie Minogue agreed. And I got a telegram as I was getting on the plane in London. We used telegrams in those days. I got a telegram saying, Kylie can't make it. You'll have to make do with Kathy Lett. For 3 hours, I thought, not 30 years. So, conception, marriage. I'd like to die in Queensland. I'm told there are advantages. You get to vote for years after the funeral. And since everything that's buried in Queensland gets dug up eventually and piped out towards the Barrier Reef, a nice way of eternity amongst the coral. Well, here I actually grew up in Sydney, and now I live in London. So I'm what is called a dual citizen. The High Court ruled last year that I can never be elected to federal parliament, which comes as a great relief. There are advantages to being a dual citizen. I have my prostate felt in London's Harley Street, and my teeth fixed in Sydney's Macquarie Street. If you've ever seen an Englishman smile, you'll understand why. Well, here I am, 70 years and 10, the Bible's estimate of sentient life. I'm in my anecdotage, so I've written this autobiography, rather his own man. The title comes from almost an episode of Yes, Minister, because a friend of mine was a minister in the Blair government and wanted to appoint me to an important judicial position. He called his permanent secretary, whose approval, of course, they had to get, his Sir Humphrey. Okay, so I'm getting to the point. What a brilliant idea, said Sir Humphrey with feigned enthusiasm. But he is rather his own man, isn't he? So I would never do what the government wanted. And the civil service opposition couldn't be overcome. But I rather liked Sir Humphrey's description of me, and I thought I'd like it for my epitaph. But since an autobiography is the next best thing, I used it. But it's an opportunity to look at the way Australia has progressed over the time I had to live in it, and it's an opportunity to see how we've changed. 50 years ago, the Australian Prime Minister announced in Washington, he said, Australia is all the way with LBJ. Today, the Australian Prime Minister says, in effect, Australia will take a dump for Donald Trump. Plus ça change. Well, to write an autobiography, there's a convention. You have to talk about your ancestry. And until I did a program called Who Do You Think You Are, I didn't know anything about my ancestors, apart from those I knew, my dear undistinguished grandparents, although one was secretary of the Dapto Dogs, which a mark of great distinction in the Wollongong area. And my mother said, don't do it. I'll find out something embarrassing about our family. And they did. very embarrassing. It turns out that my great-great-grandmother, who came to Australia first class in 1848, the year of European Revolution, sent from Berlin by the royal family, turned out to be the illegitimate daughter of Princess Radziwill and Prince Wilhelm, who later became Kaiser Wilhelm I, whose son was Kaiser Wilhelm II, to whom I'm related, a war criminal, invading Belgium and ordering unrestricted submarine warfare. So that was something of a shock, particularly as I'm related to his relatives, the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family, who changed their name to Windsor during the First World War to pretend that they weren't related to the enemy. Well, this came as a great shock to a Republican. A great shock. I've been a Republican since the age of 8. It was in 1954 that, as the Sydney Morning Herald said, every woman's dream of beauty comes ashore, the Queen's first visit to Australia. And every school kid in the city was taken to the Sydney cricket ground on a boiling hot day. It was over 95 degrees. And we had to wait there for 5 hours without shade. Kids were collapsing from sunstroke all around me. I first saw torture, really, although I couldn't put the word to it. And then suddenly, after the 5-hour wait, this big limo came out and whizzed around the cricket ground and away. That was it. That was it. And I just couldn't understand why a country could go nuts over someone who was inside the limo who we couldn't see. And, of course, we had Robert Menzies as a Prime Minister. He was forever sucking up to the royals. I did but see her passing by, and yet I'll love her till I die. Well, I did but see her passing by, but so quickly it made me a lifelong Republican. My wife and I are sometimes invited to the palace, invitations which we graciously accept, and of course, when it's revealed, we are criticized by Australia's more common commentators, Gerald Henderson, Andrew Bolt, for betraying our Republican principles. They don't understand the virtues of politeness or Cathy's point about going to Buckingham Palace, seeing the royals. Of course they're dinosaurs, but who wouldn't want to see dinosaurs in their natural habitat? I was at Buckingham Palace the other day, actually. It was I can report that the head of Australia is in fine form. She has a terrific memory. We laughed about Cathy some years ago, had made her roar with laughter by wearing a dress emblazoned with corgis. And there's a photograph in the book. The Queen remembered it well. Phil the Greek has retired, so he wasn't there. But Charles and Camilla were, and it was a strange occasion. I couldn't work out. There were 53 high commissioners of Commonwealth countries and the entire British cabinet, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, and so on. And suddenly the penny dropped. This was part of Britain's lobbying effort to have Charles elected as the head of the Commonwealth. The Queen wants to retire. It's, food in Sri Lanka and Pakistan is no good for a tummy. And the British government want Charles in this important position. But key thing is that the head of the Commonwealth is not hereditary. And all you need is a parent born in a Commonwealth country. And there are members of the Black Commonwealth who don't want Charles. They want someone inspiring. So it's a very behind the scenes of international diplomacy at the moment. There is this great question of who shall be elected and who shall Australia vote for as head of the Commonwealth. Aung San Suu Kyi was the front runner, but she's blotted her copybook over the Rohingya. Graça Machel she was Mandela's wife. I sit with her on a board at London University, and she's great, but she's getting on. And suddenly, there has become available the most charismatic, the most inspirational figure who needs a job, who could stand the Commonwealth of Nations tall against the stupidities of Donald Trump. And his father was born in Kenya. I think Australia should vote Barack Obama as head of the Commonwealth. Well, I was born in Sydney, and my very first memory is of sitting on a beach with my father, and there was a bell. I remember the bell ringing, and there was a great eruption of people out of the waves onto the sand. And my father took me aside and said, "That was the shark bell." And of course, it was my introduction to the great Australian fear of death in the water. Rupert Murdoch ran the afternoon paper. Whenever he wanted to put on circulation, he would run the famous shark deaths. It is terrifying. People, I remember people taken. People are always taken by sharks, never eaten, but taken. And it's one of the great joys for Australians as they dive into the Mediterranean. It's the only sea that doesn't have people eaters in it. And of course, on Bondi, where we lived for a few years, I learnt that great thing that's handed down by Australian fathers to their sons, and I handed it down to mine. The ability to wriggle out of your wet trunks with a towel around you to hide your penis. It was under no account in the 50s or 60s could a penis, however small, be seen on a Sydney beach. And of course, all those penises were circumcised. In the 50s and 60s, maybe still, male genital mutilation was inflicted on Australian boys at birth. And there is no, science now tells us, no reason whatsoever for doing it. And countries, Iceland and other countries, have banned circumcision. It is mutilation. You ask doctors, why did you inflict that? And they scratch and they say, well, dirt could get under the foreskin. Yeah, but you can wash it. They'd say, oh, the Jews knew all about hygiene, didn't they? Well, it's religion, not hygiene. All that we're told now that circumcision does is to diminish somewhat sexual excitement in later years. Well, in the 50s, that would have been seen as a jolly good thing. I'm not an anti-vivisectionist, but I'm an anti-circumcisionist. Now, then, of course, we moved from Bondi to Eastwood, which was a suburb, one of my parents' friends said, a suburb of no interest whatsoever. And it was, until 1956. The year that changed Australia, the year that television came to Australia, and Channel 7 built its studios just round the corner from our house. And as a 10-year-old, I could sneak in and watch Pick a Box and Jack Davy and the Quiz Kids, all usually with the very primitive technology, but it was my introduction to the art of rehearsed spontaneity. It was enormous fun. Pick a box. You had to decide, shout, whether the contestant could take the money or the box. I always shouted to take the box. I was a providentialist at an early age, but it was quite an exciting, the most exciting thing of my young life. And many years later, 40 years later, when I was a United Nations judge, I had my own court in Sierra Leone, I made a return, one of the highlights of my life. I returned to those Channel 7 studios and did a cameo part in Home and Away. You can take the boy out of Eastwood, but you can't take Eastwood out of the boy. Then, of course, it came to high school. And I'd been in an opportunity class, they called it. I don't know what it was an opportunity for, other than to go to Fort Street, which is the main selective state school in Sydney. But in the year I was to progress, the education department changed its policy, and I was streamed off to a new school, hadn't even been built, in the next suburb. My parents were devastated, and they offered to send me to Sydney's most famous GPS school, private school, Sydney Grammar School. And I absolutely refused, I adamantly refused to accept private education. And I like to think of myself as a precocious progressive at the age 11, opting for state education. But in fact, I have to admit that I simply worked out that I could spend an hour longer in bed if I went to the state school rather than to grammar. So I went to Epping Boys High School, a school without any history, without old boys, without young girls. It was a school of no significance, but it was, of course, I had to spend 5 years there, those 5 agonizing teenage years where in the land of Sir Robert Menzies, everything, you got no sex education, everything was censored, and nothing, you learned nothing about sex, except there was one group that was allowed to give one night a year a lecture to fathers and sons. It was called the Father and Son Movement, brackets incorporating Mother and Daughter, Inc. And it was a terrible experience. Very embarrassed parents, fathers, had to sit beside their even more embarrassed sons and watch on the screen tadpoles making their way toward cartoon uteri. And of course, the message was that sex with anyone other than our ultimate wife caused death. Your pictures of syphilitic sores were flashed up. And of course, it was militantly opposed to masturbation. They wouldn't say the word, but there was self-abuse, would rot the backbone, cause blindness. And they had their literature was illustrated by a picture of a teenager on a rocking horse. Growing up means leaving childish things behind. The message was that after primary school, your willy curled up in hibernation and didn't leap out until the wedding night. It was a strange. How did we find out about sex? Well, fortunately, there was this Attorney General of Victoria, a total dickhead called Arthur Ryler. And he announced that Victoria would not allow any publication, any book, that was not fit for his 14-year-old daughter. So, and then he listed all the books that would be banned from Victoria. And we kids in New South Wales rushed out to the nearest library to read Mary McCarthy's The Group, Erskine Caldwell's classic God's Little Acre. Maybe Donald Trump read the spanking scene at the time in that book when he was a kid, if you judge from Stormy's memoirs. But there it was, you know. And I suppose censorship drove me mad. It drove me to my first act of investigative journalism for the school newspaper, because all we were studying, we were doing what was called the Leaving Certificate, and our futures depended on it, because you got a Commonwealth scholarship to university or not, depending on how well you did. And you had to do English, and you had to do The Tempest, Shakespeare's play, set text. And I read it, and I thought it was a pretty unfunny and rather cruel play, the way Prospero, the all-purpose magical figure, mistreated his indigenous servant, Caliban. And anyway, I was on the train one day, and I noticed the GPS kids, my rivals, with a different edition of The Tempest, one that had more pages. So I ran down to the nearest bookshop to buy it. And of course, what happened was that some idiot in the education department had sent us the Bowdlerized edition, so that all reference to sex had been removed, including the fact that Caliban, the indigenous servant, had attempted to rape Prospero's daughter. They were the fulcrum of the plot. We state school kids, because of the obsessive censorship that applied at the time, were not allowed to understand. And just to show how ludicrous it was, Prospero's great injunction to premarital chastity, the sort of thing that the 17th century father and son movement would have entirely endorsed. But if thou dost break her virgin knot before all sacrimonious ceremonies may with full and holy rite be ministered, then no aspersion shall the heavens let fall to make your contract grow, but barren hate, sour-eyed disdain, and discord shall bestrew the union of your bed with weed so loathly that you shall hate it both. Therefore take heed, as Hymen's lamp shall light you. This extraordinary pro-chastity speech was censored, was completely missing, so that Hymen's lamps had to be dimmed and virgin knots left untied for the Leaving Certificate of 1962. But that was just one of the idiocies of the time. And the 60s were extraordinary. We had a white Australia policy. At school, I never saw anyone who wasn't white. Freckles, yes, but no dark faces. And of course, we played sport with apartheid. There was, my generation were bashed by police when we protested against South African teams in cricket and rugby, that all the blacks in South Africa were not allowed even to try out for. We had some of my mates at Sydney Uni. I made my first appearance in the Australian newspaper interviewing 4 of them about their experience on the 1969 Wallaby Tour, where they were appalled, and they made the point that Australian sporting links with apartheid South Africa were used in South Africa as an endorsement of sport. And it was the great 1970 tour where all the premiers, Bjelke Petersen, Askin, Bolte, and weak McMahon government endorsed the Springbok Tour of Australia. And Peter Hain came out and to protest. I defended him later at the Old Bailey for trying to stop and Gough Whitlam, the new leader of the Labour Party, was on side. Bob Hawke had become president of the ACTU. And there was blood on the pitch as the police beat up protesters who dared to suggest that Australia should not play with apartheid. And quite emotional about this. It only came to an end because the cricket tour with an entirely white team where blacks had been refused permission to play. The cricket tour was 1971, there was a great debate, and finally, the greatest Australian cricketer ever, the head of the Cricket Australia, said, "We shall not play cricket with South Africa until they drop the racial disqualification." And we didn't for 22 years. So there was a time when Australians could be proud of leading the way. The other thing that we objected to in the 60s that got us the police bashing was the habit of Victorians of hanging people. They really did. Balti really did love the noose. And the Tate case, he had to be threatened by the High Court to stop him hanging a mentally disturbed man. And then in Robert Ryan was the last to be hanged in 1967, by which time I was president of the Sydney University Union and organised a big demonstration. You never guess where the demonstration was held. We held it outside the Victorian Tourist Bureau in Sydney. For Victorians in the 60s, their world was so small that they had their tourist bureau in Sydney. But reading up on the death penalty did make me, I suppose, interested in one day defending, there was the Stewart case, Rupert Mac Stewart, whom Playford, another odious premier, had tried to hang. And in 1969, I went to dinner, I was invited to dinner with Sir Garfield Barwick, who had been preeminent Australian advocate in the Privy Council. And believe it or not, the Privy Council, 5 or 7 British law lords, were the top court in Australia. We'd get very good judgments from our High Court, which was perhaps the best in the common law world, and then you could appeal them to the Privy Council, who knew nothing, cared nothing about Australia, and until 1986, it was our top court. Anyway, Barwick was induced to tell me his favourite story. It was about the 13 little Malaysians. They were communist subversives, and they were sentenced to death. And while he was over in London, he was induced to defend 12 of them. And he took a very short point about an inadequacy in their arrest warrant. The counsel for the 13th made a florid appeal about the death penalty, but didn't take the point. Well, a few weeks later, the judgment came down, Barwick's argument was accepted, and the 12 were let out of prison. The 13th, whose case was the same in all respects, but whose counsel hadn't taken the point, was taken out and hanged. It was a shocking story, but it did make this point, not just you're smart if you retain Barwick, but it was that I say to young lawyers today that if you want to be a force in law, if you want to change society, you must study law and you must understand it, because if you just come bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, that doesn't work. And I took that very much to task and to heart when I became the main death row defender in the Privy Council between about 1975 and 1995. The penalty, the Privy Council sitting, all these judges sitting in Downing Street, were the final court of appeal, the court of last resort for men who were sentenced to death throughout the Caribbean, in Mauritius, in Hong Kong, in Singapore for a while. And I would read up the transcripts and try to find some legal point. But the problem for a death row advocate is you can't change the law. If the people want hanging, then it's there in their constitution. And if Britain had specifically, when it gave independence to these countries, had specifically preserved the death penalty. So no matter what the evidence that the death penalty doesn't work, it nonetheless cannot be it cannot be trumped by a legal argument. And the tragedy was that all the obscene ritual of the old colonial use of the death penalty had been adopted by these new countries. The reading of the warrant, the last meal, the greasing of the trap, the weighing the condemned man, hanging always at dawn with an official party that sat for a regulation hour around the corpse, eating breakfast. And never, this was an old Home Office tradition from Britain, never was the body given back to the relatives. As the Home Office said, hanging elongates the neck. You couldn't see the giraffe effect. So it's always, men hanged in Britain were always buried in the prison. In Jamaica, they used to bury them in the prison garden and win prizes for their vegetables. They're very proud of that. But I used to go to these death rows, and I went on one occasion to the death row in Trinidad, where I spent some time with Michael X. He was a Black Power leader in the 60s. He's there on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. He was a mate of John Lennon, and he went back to Trinidad and ended up convicted and on death row. And it was an awful experience. It was like there were about 30 men. They were in monkey cages. There's no other way to describe it. And they were screaming. Some of them were mentally disordered. Some of them were just deranged by staying there for years because the state didn't get round to dealing with them, and they were on death row. And I said to Michael, this is really a place of torture, of mental torture. The Constitution preserves the death penalty, but it also bans torture. Why don't we argue that a prolonged stay on death row is a form of torture and requires commutation of the death sentence? And Michael, I'll never forget, he put his finger to his lips. He said, listen, just listen. And you could have heard a pin drop. All those men were pressed against the cages, listening, trying to catch every word. And he said, you must make that argument. Make it for them, not for me. They're going to kill me. But promise me that you'll make that argument. And they did kill him. The death penalty besmirches everyone involved in it, and they rushed him to the gallows at midnight. So we couldn't get an injunction from a judge to delay the execution. But I did eventually make the argument in a case which was heard by the Privy Council. It was heard for the first time by 7 judges, the first time since 1951, when the Australian Bank's nationalisation case had been heard by 7, and 2 of them had died while listening to Dr. Evatt. Superstitiously, they didn't sit until 7, until this case was so important. And we succeeded in arguing that over 2 years on death row required commutation, and that ruling has been accepted throughout the Commonwealth, sadly not in Indonesia, where Chan and Sukumaran were, I think, executed after 10 years on death row. And at that stage, the state is simply executing, not killing them, the man who committed the murder. They had changed, as many do. Some go mad, and some, of course, were innocent all the time. So the death sentence work by Australian trustees in Victoria was useful in the course of my Privy Council practice. Well, how did I end up at the Old Bailey? Here I was in school, in high school, and in the 1960s. What was it that inspired me? I'll tell you. It all had to do with censorship. In 1960, an Old Bailey jury acquitted Penguin Books for publishing Lady Chatterley's Lover. And a neighbour of ours, Fred Osborne, was Menzies' Minister for Air, so he was in Menzies' cabinet. And he told me this story. It was absolutely true, that because Menzies was such an Anglophile, they all assumed that because Britain was reading Lady Chatterley happily, that it would be allowed into Australia. And he said, Bob Menzies came into the cabinet room with a book, and he said, "I'm not going to allow my wife to read this book." At least he didn't bother about his servants, but he wasn't. So the Dame Patty Menzies protection test kept Lady Chatterley's Lover out of the country. And not only content with banning Lady Chatterley, they banned a little Penguin special about the trial of Lady Chatterley, called The Trial of Lady Chatterley. But there was a very cunning and courageous Sydney bookseller who had a lot of friends in England, and he got them to transcribe longhand every word in The Trial of Lady Chatterley and send it to him in aerograms. Aerograms were big blue letters that would go through customs as personal mail. So he got, and he reassembled the book and reprinted it. And a copy fell into my schoolboy hands. And it did deprave and corrupt me, I guess, not by the exceedingly large number of four-letter words, not by the erudite debate on D.H. Lawrence, but by the forensic, my love of the forensic tactics of Lady Chatterley's defenders, Gerald Gardner, whom I used saw for Spycatcher, and Jeremy Hutchinson, whom I later worked with at the Old Bailey. And on the 30th anniversary of the trial of Lady Chatterley's publication, I was asked by Penguin Books to contribute the introduction, which gave me great pleasure because it had, I suppose, more impact on me. But that was what decided me to become a barrister and to appear at London's Old Bailey. And in the book I talk about getting there, but get there I did. And the very first case I appeared at the Old Bailey, I still had traces of my nasal Australian vowels. I'd say France or branch. And I had to defend before a particularly difficult, sarcastic High Court judge the conviction of my client. I had to tell him what it was about. He'd been convicted of wearing an indecent T-shirt. And I got on my feet very high, nervous, my first appearance at the fabled Old Bailey, and said, my lord, this is a case about a T-shirt. My lord, the logo reads, "Fuck art, let's dance." And there was a terrifying silence, and the judge boomed, "Fuck art, let's what, Mr. Robertson?" And I said, dance, my lad, dance. Oh, he said, you're an Australian. What you'll have to learn to say, Mr. Robertson, if you want to succeed at the English bar, is fuck out, let's dance. There was lots of sycophantic laughter in court. He was so delighted at humiliating another young barrister that he acquitted my client. Linguistic antipathy cuts both ways. I mean, when Alex Downer became briefly leader of the Liberal Party, he had to hire a voice coach to change his accent from BBC English to Channel 9 Australian, to teach him to say dance and not dance, to amputate the endings of words of more than one syllable. As Cathy says, it's just too hot in Australia to say all of a long word. But at least we pronounce our swear words in exactly the same way. But I became a barrister in wig and gown in the Old Bailey. I didn't approve of wigs and gowns, and indeed the only danger in a barrister's life at the Old Bailey comes when you have to attach the collar stud from the stud from your collar to your collarless shirt. And if you press too hard on the gland just above the carotid artery, it can cut off the blood supply to the brain and cause unconsciousness and possibly death. It's useful information if you defend a strangler. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he just pressed a little too hard. I led a movement against wigs and gowns, and the Bar Council said, all right, we'll ask our clients. We'll take a poll of the criminals, the defendants at the Old Bailey. And they all wanted us to keep them. I like my brief dressed proper. And there was one time when I was glad that I was wearing a wig and gown, and that was when I defended, for its first time, the film Deep Throat that had been imported and seized by the police and prosecuted for indecency. And it was a sex case, so they had to have an all-male jury in those days. And the prosecution opened the case very fairly. This is a case about a film. Gentlemen of the jury, it will be for you to decide whether it's indecent or not. The lights went down, and this Lovelace flashed on the screen, and 90 minutes later, the lights went up. And nobody moved. The judge made his exit in a kind of crouching position. And the jury just stayed in the jury box. And the little old lady usher said, come on, it's lunchtime. And they didn't move, the 12 red-faced men, and true, good men and true. And she said, come on, I've got to get me lunch. And still they didn't move. And we barristers wrapped our gowns loosely about us and decided there was some point in some cases in wearing them. The jury, believe it or not, couldn't agree. What we called a well-hung jury. Well, I went on to other cases. My most famous case in those days was defending a madam named Cynthia Payne. It was turned into a film, Personal Services, and a book, An English Madam. It went round the world, and it didn't seem to me to be of any real importance. It was simply a woman who'd been caught as a running a disorderly house, although it was a very orderly house. People stood on the stairs with luncheon vouchers, which entitled them to meet one of the hostesses. And it was in Streatham, a leafy part of South London, and she had to plead guilty. She was banged to rights, and I asked to examine the policeman and about the nature of her clientele, and elicited from him that there was a peer of the realm, there was an MP, there were company directors, solicitors, barristers, and several vicars. The press liked that. There was a cartoon in The Guardian of a puzzled policeman looking at the bed on which a vicar is disporting himself with a prostitute and saying, "I demand to see my solicitor, who is in the next bedroom." Anyway, my mitigation that it was unfair to jail the woman when all the upper-class men went free drove the judge mad. He sentenced her to years in prison. It was outrageous, and of course, it was used around the world as an example of British hypocrisy. My mother called me from Eastwood to say, "Darling, you've made the front page of Mr. Murdoch's newspaper. Thank goodness they spelt your name wrongly." But Cynthia, because of all the publicity, the Court of Appeal had to come back in the law vacation and shorten her sentence. They were furious. But she was released from prison early and rushed to the BBC, who asked her why hadn't she allowed me to name her famous clients. She thought for a moment and said, "Well, me morals is low, but me ethics is high." A distinction that had eluded philosophers for centuries. Her future on the chat show circuit was assured. But the most, I suppose the most bizarre, I'll read you a passage to jog my memories. The most bizarre and most publicized of my cases came in 1995, after a world exclusive in the Sunday Mirror, which was also a front-page story in Australia and everywhere else. Die Spy Sensation, the most amazing pictures you'll ever see. The photographs were spread over 7 pages of Princess Diana exercising on a contraption called a leg press, taken by a camera sneakily hidden in the ceiling by the gym owner, an impecunious New Zealander. The princess, out to prove herself after her separation from Prince Charles, was advised, badly as it turned out, to go down in British history by issuing a novel action which would create a hitherto unrecognized civil wrong, invasion of privacy. The High Court judge who first heard her claim thought such a dramatic change in the law should at least be contested. He extended legal aid and asked me to represent the New Zealander, which would mean cross-examining the people's princess. I need to explore, under cross-examination, Diana's two-faced attitude to privacy. A mock-up courtroom was constructed at Kensington Palace so she could prepare for my cross-examination, and 940 journalists applied for the 75 press seats in Court 36 of the Royal Courts of Justice. The courtroom artists who produced what were meant to be accurate portraits of court proceedings, but who were banned from sketching in court, had already painted our encounter. I was depicted all jowls and splutter, pitted against the Queen of Hearts, radiant in the witness box. Well, I prepared for this case by doing something I'd avoided throughout my life, joining a gym. I even learnt to cardio funk, a type of exercise Diana had been doing at the gym, which, quote, combines funky dance steps, with aerobic moves set to hip-hop music. I avoided her choreographed colonics, but learnt the art of toning my buttock muscles on instruments of torture called the life cycle, the rotary torso, the lateral pull-down machine, and the Concept 2 rowing ergometer. The tabloids rejoiced, salivated, in fact, over the upcoming courtroom clash. The Times described me as, quote, anti-establishment, Republican, and Australian, presumably in ascending order of horror. Journalists doorstepped my parents at our Sydney home. What advice would they give the princess? I would settle out of court, said my father. And so she did. On the evening before the trial of the century, there was a deal, and her lawyers withdrew her claim after depositing $1 million in the New Zealander's Swiss bank account to pretend that he'd withdrawn. I cancelled my gym membership, forgot about cardio funk, and moved on, somewhat deflated, as always, when a big case settles at the door of the court. It's a condition my wife called cortus interruptus. I wrote about the first Human Rights Act case. In the year 2000, the Human Rights Act came into force in the United Kingdom, and to national astonishment, its first beneficiary was my client, the American boxer Mike Tyson. He was the youngest heavyweight champion of the world ever, at the age of 20, and a convicted rapist a few years later. In 1995, age 34, he was released. 5 years later, he was out to retain his heavyweight crown from Lennox Lewis. He fought a bout in Glasgow with American Lou Savarese on a freezing night in a hall packed with Scots baying for blood. It wasn't long in flowing. After 12 seconds, Tyson floored Savarese, who went down for a count of 8. "Fight on," said the ref unwisely. Savarese could barely stand. Tyson landed a left hook that shook him, and then, as every good boxer would be trained to do in these circumstances, I found myself later telling the court, went in for the knockout. At this point, the ref interposed himself and claimed to have said, "Stop boxing." But then, as a result of what I later described as, quote, inadvertent contact with Tyson's upper arm, the ref himself went down. And Tyson kept hitting his opponent onto the ropes. After just 38 seconds, the fight ended. The shaken referee declared Tyson the winner. As microphones were pushed in his face, the victor made comments which were alleged to be detrimental to boxing and to the public interest. Tyson was hauled before the British Boxing Board of Control, and the media had no doubt the board's intention had been leaked that his license to fight would be cancelled. This case involved a delicate examination of the role of hype, which had come to infect this particular sport, an expectation that boxers would sledge their future opponents to whet the bloodthirsty appetites of a potential audience and thus swell the gate, their profit from the event. It had started with Cassius Clay, otherwise known as Muhammad Ali, but his promises were poetic. "I'm gonna float like a butterfly and sting like a bee." After the match, Tyson's declaration to Lennox Lewis was, "I'm coming for you, Lennox Lewis. God, I am mad. I'm gonna rip your heart out and eat your children." My first defense was, quote, "Since Lennox Lewis has no children and boxing gloves don't rip through flesh, this comment is ludicrous and fantasized. Not even the law's measure of naivety, the moron in a hurry, would take it seriously or imagine for a moment it was intended as a threat." This argument didn't seem to be convincing the board, so I rolled out the new Human Rights Act, which now had to be applied to all public bodies. It gave particular importance to freedom of speech, which could be curbed only in the interests of public safety or preventing crime, not in the interests of boxing. To take away Tyson's livelihood for making ridiculous remarks would not only be unlawful, it could open the board to a suit for damages. Besides which, I said, Tyson's remarks were an ironic response to racist stereotyping. You treat me as if I were a jungle savage, so I'll play along with your stereotype. Here I may have misattributed a degree of sophistication to my client. The truth is, he was so pumped up with adrenaline that in the few minutes after being declared victor, he could have said anything. That's why there's a rule that radio and television interviews with boxers are not permitted in the ring following a contest, a rule that had been blatantly breached. The case went on into the evening. The board came back merely with a reprimand. I couldn't tell which argument had convinced them not to cancel his boxing license, although press reports of their decision were headlined, "Tyson lands human rights uppercut to boxing board." Thereafter, the act would benefit many more worthy clients, but the case did make the point that human rights are for everyone, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I want to say a word, because it's a difficult time for human rights, for international cooperation. I went on from the Old Bailey to an international practice, which started with Amnesty International and going on missions for it, and then I got involved with Václav Havel, who was the dissident leader in Czechoslovakia, being back and forth to prison. He was one of the most courageous men that I've ever met. We defended the president of the Jazz Society. Can you believe that the Stalinists were actually imprisoning the head of an organization that devoted to jazz? I said to him, well, why do fascists hate jazz? Hitler banned it, Stalin banned it. He said, because it's music you can talk under. I can't bear jazz. You keep thinking it will turn into a tune, and it doesn't. But we had, we were kicking up a fuss about this trial of the president of the Jazz Society. It was telephone justice, no lickspittle judges. They were regarded as political workers, and they'd be called by the party leader the night before to be told what sentence to deliver. It was what everyone else calls a kangaroo court. I can't use that phrase. I don't know what our beloved marsupial has done to be associated with injustice. But anyway, we were in court, and the president of the Jazz Society was jailed for 2 years, which was a brief sentence. If we hadn't kicked up a fuss about it, it would have been a lot more. I remember walking out in Prague to the court entrance in Charles Square and seeing a crowd of people who started, when they saw us, started singing, "We Shall Overcome." I said, this is great that we've got supporters. He said, yes, and on these occasions, you can always tell who are the secret police. They're the ones who know all the words. Well, I want to say something about the problems of international cooperation, because international cooperation is almost at an end. There was a period where international justice flourished. There was a period where Milosevic was put on trial, Karadzic and Mladic were jailed, where my own court in Sierra Leone put Charles Taylor down, the author of the appalling brutality in West Africa. But that sort of ended, I think, about 2011. I remember writing an article about Assad had only killed 800 peaceful protesters at that point. They were holding banners. Assad to The Hague, expectations of international justice were far too high. And of course now, 400,000 have been killed, and half of Syria is displaced. So, and the Security Council is absolutely poleaxed. And even the Human Rights Committee, they passed a motion by China, supported by all those nasty states that want to shore up their tyrants, supporting sovereignty, that the United Nations, instead of supporting a universal basis for human rights, should support human rights as defined by different sovereign nations, by China, which puts human rights lawyers in jail for a long time. But it's Russia that has given an idea that I would like to see other democracies endorse. We can't now rely on other states to give up their human rights abuses, to agree to set up courts, international courts. What we can do, though, is to identify and to deter those from foreigners who are involved in human rights abuses. And this is called a Magnitsky Act. It's a strange name, but every newspaper in Britain is talking about it at the moment because Britain is passing one. I'll tell you a little about it. Sergei Magnitsky was a tax lawyer in Moscow. He discovered a rip-off. 250 million were being stolen from his client company by senior figures, quite close to Putin, tax officials and police. And he blew the whistle. And of course, what happened to him? He was arrested, thrown into jail, tortured, and killed. Those responsible for his death included police chiefs and tax officials and judges who turned a blind eye, who refused to release him on bail when they should have, lickspittle lawyers. His client was called Bill Browder, author of a book called Red Notice, a client of mine. When he started by identifying in publications the persons responsible for Sergei's death. One of them came to London, a policeman, allegedly with a salary of £15,000 a year, put £2 million in the hands of the most expensive lawyers in London to sue Bill. I represented him and did the defense, and we got the case thrown out. Then Bill, using his American contacts, persuaded the Obama administration in 2012 to pass the Global Magnitsky Act, which is a US act that enables them to freeze the assets in American banks of foreign human rights abusers and to refuse them entry into the States and to name and shame them. And I'm glad that among the 17 of the original Magnitsky targets, there were 3 judges who had, in my view, behaved quite outrageously. So it's not confined to Russia. Canada last year published a much better Magnitsky Act, which enabled seizure as well as freezing of human rights, money of human rights abusers. England, as a result of Skripal, the killing, which probably, but not certainly, was by Russia, and there was, in Litvinenko's case 10 years ago, the Russian state killed this dissident by plutonium. They left plutonium all over Mayfair, and the government was too frightened or too desirous of good relations with Russia to do anything. And I acted against a lot of these oligarchs. I had one of them who was left messages on my answering machine the sound of machine gun firing. And another journalist, Paul Klebnikov, who was assassinated by Boris Berezovsky. And it's a murky business. But the idea of Magnitsky laws, which have now been adopted by the European Union and by a number of states in Europe and are being put into the British sanctions bill, is that the democracies of the world, since we can't at the moment get cooperation from Russia, China, and other countries, that the democracies of the world should, using their own sovereign powers, name, shame, and blame individual abusers. Now, it's important that we go a stage further and not only ban them, but ban their children from coming to Eton, ban their parents from going to Harley Street, stop them getting advantages from their abuse. People say, well, we don't like visiting the sins of the fathers on the children. But the most disgusting man I've ever investigated, he was an Israeli general selling arms to the Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar's outfit. I remember begging me not to name him. He said, I only did it for my family, for my children. Okay, well, it's fair enough. Navalny, the other day, Putin's real opponent, who wasn't allowed to stand, said, you know, Putin's mates have all got children at Eton. The only way you're going to change these people's behavior is to make the game not worth the candle, because they want to use Western banks. They want to gamble at in Western casinos. And this is the way forward. And it's a way that Australia should be part of. If Canada, Britain, European countries and the US have Magnitsky laws, then Australia should too. And I see no reason why stopping the children of human rights abusers going to Eton shouldn't be extended to those going to Sydney Grammar or Geelong Grammar. It's really something that Western nations have to step up to the plate. And since international justice can't be at the moment done through a poleaxed Security Council, this is one way forward. It's a pity it has this name, Magnitsky Law, but it is, I think, the next step for human rights. Now, finally, let me tell you or read you a little about a difficult time in my own life and about perhaps how the personal and the political cross over in mine. My parents, having met in Townsville, ended up in Longueville. It's a suburb of Sydney overlooking a bay, and they lived there for 55 years. I would always call my mother before I went abroad to make sure she was okay, and to, I suppose, it was at least in London. I was only 24 hours away. I'd spoken to, and this is set in mid-December 2016. I'd spoken to her only the previous week when she said she felt better after a couple of days of illness and was back to her permanent chair beside my father, who was 95, keeping him company as his mind traveled quietly towards dementia. I always called her because before I took a flight overseas, a subconscious need to know she was okay. This time, the flight was to Israel to give a lecture on genocide at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Telling Jewish people about genocide may seem a superfluous exercise, but it was an opportunity to develop my theory about the links between the Armenian massacres and the Holocaust. just as I was checking in at the King David Hotel, festooned with images of all the great statesmen who'd stayed there, a Michelin man approached the desk in tight-fitting, luminous lycra shorts with muscles rippling. "Where's the gym?" asked Tony Abbott. Then I saw the sign, "Meeting Australia-Israel Dialogue." We chatted about the uncertainty of the times, the glint in his eye suggesting that the uncertainty would extend to the Australian Prime Ministership, from which he'd been ousted by Malcolm Turnbull a couple of months before. Later, I bumped into Bill Shorten and his team after a busy day in which they'd managed to meet both Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas. It's touching, really, how Australians think that by coming to the Middle East, they can help to solve the insoluble. I did my bit by prefacing my lecture with a welcome to country on behalf of the occupied Palestinians. But I doubt that this will catch on in Israel. I allowed my hosts to take me on the Christian tourist trail along the Stations of the Cross in Old Jerusalem. It's a favorite tour with visitors, a chance to see the stations where Jesus faltered while carrying his cross to the hill of Golgotha. At the fourth, where Jesus is said to have stopped to farewell his mother, there's even a tracing of where her feet were imprinted in the sand. I had a definite presentiment about my own mother, as well as a fleeting thought that I couldn't remember this station from all my studies of the Gospels to defend blasphemers. I was slightly shaken and anxious to get back to the King David, where I received an email that my mother had gone to hospital for tests, but nothing to worry about. It would be good to get back to London in case there was. And when I did, I had the expatriate's nightmare to be woken by a telephone call in the small hours and told that a parent is dying. The call came from my brother Tim in Sydney at 5 a.m. Mum's critical in hospital. She wants to say goodbye. It was Christmas time, so all the flights from London were packed. Surely, I remonstrated with my travel agent, there must be another airline. Malaysian can't be full. It was. Finally, he found the last seat, first class only, on Singapore Airlines in 4 hours' time. It's very expensive. Why not wait for 12 hours for QF2? But this was no time to bother about money. By the time I landed in Singapore, emails from my brother were reporting my mother was hanging on, but only just. It was 7 more hours to Sydney. The line and a kindly immigration officer made the magic sign on my entry card, signifying not suspicious, led straight through. I'd brought no baggage, and soon my taxi driver was hammering across Sydney to the Royal North Shore Hospital, where my brother Tim was waiting outside. The public wing of the Royal North Shore, will they drop the Royal when we become a republic? I wondered idly, had just been rebuilt and gave a good impression of being a happy Christmassy place. We took the lift to the 9th floor. Ward 9E was unusual in that, unlike other wards, it had no name and no description. That, said my brother, is because it's the death ward. Easy to deduce, but not easy to face when you have a close relative in it. Christmas Eve was spent on death watch. The occupant of the next bed had passed on, and I could sleep there restlessly, although not as restlessly as my poor mother. I watched as the nurses from India and Fiji held and washed her so gently. There was also a matter still bothering me, that apparent premonition at the 4th station of the cross. I'm not superstitious, for one thing, and besides, why couldn't I recall this meeting from all the blasphemy trials? I defended gay news, I defended Salman Rushdie, and I know my Gospels pretty well. I asked at the nurse's station for a Bible. They couldn't find one. A sign of the advance of secularity when even our death wards have no Bibles. Eventually, a book by Mr. Gideon was found in another ward, and a quick flip through the Apostles confirmed that my memory was correct. Half the so-called Stations of the Cross, including the fourth, are Catholic frauds, dreamt up, says Wikipedia, so this may not be correct, by St. Francis of Assisi in the 14th century and perpetuated in Jerusalem for the benefit of the tourist trade. This information actually came as a relief. My presentiment was not a supernatural message from the Mother of God at the place where she parted from her Son, merely a reminder to and by myself that I should keep an eye on my sick parent. Although I've seen bullet-ridden bodies in my human rights work, I'd never been at a deathbed. I assumed it would be like the last scene in La Boheme, the heroine reclining and declining, singing in a lower register, the tenor turning his back to gaze out the window while his friends are the first to realize that the fat lady will not sing again. A modern version would have doctors and social workers singing to relatives their resigned aria, "Miracles do not happen." Our public hospitals are now predisposed towards the easeful death philosophy of Peter Singer, a philosophy I did something to disseminate in hypotheticals. That didn't stop me from questioning it, although in my mother's case it was a no contest. She was an enthusiastic euthanasiast and had left us clear instructions to end the kind of pain that I had watched her endure after the past 2 nights. On Christmas Day, just as families were settling down to joyful lunches, she stopped breathing. I'm relieved in a way that I was not actually with her. At the very end, I'd left for a quick visit to my hapless father, wheelchair-bound in the family home, and not quite realizing what was happening. They'd been married for 73 years, and when the message came, I couldn't tell him. I gave the eulogy for my mother at the funeral, raised a few laughs at my brother Graham's expense, particularly from his children, when I told how Mum had wrestled with the dilemma about what to do with the cannabis plant that as a rebellious teenager he'd grown in her beloved garden. Should she uproot it, or should she report it to the police? In the end, she decided to leave it, but I'm certainly not going to water it. We knew the risk. When one long-term partner dies, the other often follows within a short time. My father evinced that intention by the simple expedient of refusing to eat. Before long, he was being treated in hospital with enough success for me to return to England for a few weeks. Back in Britain, life had never been so boring. Brexit was an intelligence test that its citizens had failed. I had a bet on the result with the philosopher A.C. Grayling some months before the referendum. "Oh, the British are far too intelligent to vote to leave," he said. "They will," I countered. "I'm an Australian and I know how Anglo-Saxons can panic at the prospect of swarthy people in boats coming towards them." There would be lots of refugees in boats on the Med this summer, just when the referendum was to be held. AC bet me a dinner, which I accepted. But he's smart and was first to ask where I would take him when he won. "Oh," I said expensively, "to Sky Gingell's new restaurant at Somerset House." "Where will you take me?" "To the Garrick," AC replied, "his men-only club which serves overcooked beef and a pudding called Spotted Dick." I'd not yet bothered to collect my winnings. I made plans for an early return, disrupted by a bout of bronchial pneumonia picked up in the freeze of the English winter. The inevitable email arrived. My father had died peacefully in his sleep, and it was off to Heathrow again. I arrived the night before his funeral and painfully coughed my way through an eulogy. It was all so familiar, this ritual in the crematorium chapel, the arguments over the music. I would have preferred Dad to depart to There Is Nothing Like a Dame. After all, he had Betty Boop on the fuselage of his kiddie. But I was outvoted. There's much to be said, funeral directors, please note, for ending sad services with a blast. The best conclusion to a commemoration that I've attended was for Sir Thomas Bingham, a brilliant law lord in Westminster Abbey. After all the gloomy reminiscences, there emerged from behind the catafalque a fully fledged New Orleans jazz band, belting out When the Saints Come Marching In. One heartening feature of my father's funeral was the attendance in full uniform of the RAAF top brass, honouring one of their last combat pilots from Australia's 1st Fighter Squadron. Afterwards, I walked into the leafy grounds of the crematorium to observe the resting place of my parents' ashes, beneath a straggling shrub that needed watering. There was a space for more containers, the crematorium official heavily hinted. Perhaps I might purchase a place. I've always been a bit leery of ending up as ashes, ever since a client, a defendant in a big drugs bust, had the container on his desk seized by police, who sent it off for forensic analysis, believing that the substance inside would be some exotic drug. It was, however, his mother. I was, as a child, much taken by Robin Hood, who roused himself from his deathbed, called for his trusty bow and one arrow, and used the last of his strength to shoot it into Sherwood Forest. "Bury me where you find it," was his dying instruction to Friar Tuck, presumably his executor. But I've always fancied a tombstone, which could elliptically be inscribed, rather his own man. Spike Milligan has an appropriate epitaph: "I told you I was ill." Cathy, the novelist, wants on hers, "At last, a good plot." I returned to the family house, overlooking the tinkling masts of boats in the bay, where my twin parental anchors had been moored for half a century. I stayed alone for a fortnight, nursing my bronchitis, on the sunny balcony, fobbing off inquiries from estate agents who'd scented a commission from the death notices in the Herald. The house seemed smaller now, my parents were not in it, and it felt odd to be orphaned at the age of 70. Languidly, I watched the ABC program Q&A, on which I occasionally appear, and with nothing better to do, spoke aloud the answers I would have given had I been on the panel. Yasmin Abdel-Magid declared that Sharia law was feminist. I put her right, as I hope did the ABC fact-checkers. Everyone seemed to be freaking out about a blackout in South Australia caused by a freak storm, but alleged to be punishment for the state's reliance on alternative energy. Come on, I apostasized. Blackouts are productive. Remember all the babies who were born 9 months after that big blackout in New York? We could do with more South Australians. They're quite useful. Don Bradman, the Chapel Brothers, Julian Disney. And the occasional blackout is a small price to pay for doing the right thing by climate change. Here's my message to South Australians. Next time there's a blackout, just light the candles and fuck. That would have shocked the audience, but enlivened a dull program. Tony Jones would pretend to be upset about the use of the F word, and I would say that the ABC doubtless has fuck-checkers as well as fact-checkers. But wait a minute, could I say the word fuck? Not if my mother had been watching, which she always was, but not now. Perhaps I would say it as an example of how my life might change. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight. I'm happy to sign books. The appearance of an autobiography isn't an indication that I'm going to hang up my wig and gown. I'm often tempted now to end my life on an island or write a novel. I could appear at literary festivals or lecture at universities, but I always remember the adage on John Mortimer's coffee cup: old lawyers never die. They just lose their appeal. Thank you.